David Whetter is a soil scientist, agroecologist, and registered professional agrologist. He has 23 years of consulting experience in agricultural environmental planning, permitting, and management with a focus on the soil landscape environment, agricultural management systems, and agricultural water management. David is founder and president of AgriEarth Consulting Limited, and a firm established to add value and provide environmental solutions to agriculture and related sectors across the Canadian prairies and beyond. So please join me in welcoming David here to Ag Days.
Thank you, Ashley. Can everyone hear me okay at the back there, Lorianne? Yep. Okay, thank you. Many years ago, I was giving my master's defense, and my dad was in the audience, and I looked up at one point, and I saw that I had actually put him to sleep. So hopefully Dad's in the audience today, and hopefully it's a different outcome for him and all of you as well. I'm happy to be here today at Ag Days to speak to you a little bit about tile drainage. Ashley did a good job of the introduction there. I'd like to thank Manitoba Crop Alliance for inviting me to speak today, and thank you all for attending as well. I'm aware I'm the only thing between you all and lunch, so I'll endeavor to make this worth your while. One takeaway I want you to get from the presentation today is that similar to any significant land management practice, tile drainage has what we call trade-offs. So what that means is there's benefits to the practice and there's costs as well. And I'm hoping that comes through in the presentation today. And just as a spoiler, title of the presentation is When Does Tile Make Sense with a C? I don't have the answer to that, so I'm not going to give it to you today, but we'll kind of work through some of the things behind tile that'll hopefully provide some information of when it makes sense. I just have to find my clicker here. Okay, I thought it'd be good to have a little bit of an icebreaker at the start of the presentation. However, I didn't know any tile drainage jokes, so I leaned on ChatGPT to help me out. After a few attempts, it had come up with a pretty good punchline, but the setup line was pretty terrible, so I had to kind of intervene and help out. So hopefully together we pulled it off. So why did the canola bolt when it saw a farmer installing tile drainage? And the clicker's not working here. Oh yeah, okay, there it is. Because I thought I was getting a root canal. Okay, it's not great, but the illustration that ChatGPT came up with, I think is even better than the joke. So today I'm going to start off fairly basic. I'll give you an overview of tile drainage, just kind of how it works. I'll go through some basic design considerations. I'll follow that with some of the kind of in-field or on-farm benefits. And then I'll move into some of these downstream considerations, what happens to that tile water when it leaves the field. And kind of associated with that is a discussion around beneficial management practices and options we have to address where those downstream impacts may be in a negative direction. And finally, I'll close with some recent research findings on a research site we have set up just down the road from Hartney, Manitoba. Okay, so for an overview of tile drainage here, this slide just shows some basic concepts of soil water holding capacity, and I think it's pretty critical in understanding how tile works. So on the left-hand side of the figure there, we have a concept called saturation, and that's when mostly all of our soil pore space is filled with water. When soils are at saturation, plant roots can't get the oxygen they need, and they're essentially drowning. So underneath that cube of soil, there's a collection pan, or it's kind of that bathtub analogy. When soils are at saturation, and if they're allowed to freely drain, water will flow through that soil and drip out into that collection pan or into that bathtub, or in the case of tile, it'll drip into the tile. On the right-hand side of the figure there, the permanent wilting point's kind of the other end of the spectrum, and that's where there's not enough water in the soil that the plants can actually access it. So this is getting into that drought scenario. In the middle there, we have what's called field capacity, and this is kind of the sweet spot for agriculture. This is where it's the maximum amount of water that a soil can hold, and the maximum amount of water that, against the forces of gravity, I should say, and the maximum amount of soil water that's available for crop growth. So when the soil waters, or tile drainage only removes the soil water that's above field capacity and getting into that saturation zone. So that's kind of an important takeaway there. Tile doesn't have any kind of suction to it, and it doesn't kind of dry out the soil below field capacity. Okay, so what is a tile drain? So at a basic level, tile drains are just simply these perforated black plastic pipes. They have different types of perforations depending on soil type. And this one here, shown here, has a fabric envelope or sock, and that's used when we have high silt concentrations of the soil, and it just it allows that silt to stay out of the pipe and doesn't clog it up. These tile drainage pipes are placed in the ground, typically 2 to 3 feet below ground, somewhere around 50 feet spacing, plus or minus. That spacing is kind of the standard for Manitoba, but it varies, and it should vary based on soil type, design objectives, as well as other factors like the presence of salinity. There's kind of a delay here when I click. So tile drainage works, again, by removing that saturation water from the crop rooting zone. Another term for this saturation water when it's in the rooting zone is a shallow water table. The figure here on the left-hand side, it shows that situation where we have a shallow water table that's, obviously in the image here impacting that plant's ability to put down crop roots deep into the profile and access nutrients and that type of thing. On the right-hand side there, this shows that same scenario, but with these perforated tile pipes placed underground. So you can see that those tile pipes pull that water table down to the level of the tile at the location of the tile, and it creates a groundwater mound in between the tile, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. I just thought I'd put this up here just to show some Manitoba context about how much tile drainage is actually has occurred on the landscape. Prior to 2015, so between 1995 and 2015, there was data voluntarily reported to Manitoba Agricultural Services Corporation. So these numbers are probably underrepresentations of what was actually out there. However, we know it's relatively few acres, kind of in that 50,000 or less as of 2015. Fast forward to current day, we've got somewhere around 300,000 acres or slightly more tile drained. I think we're tiling maybe around that 15 or 20,000 acres per year. There's about 10 commercial tile plows operating. So there's certainly been a kind of a ramp up of activity in the last 10 years or so. Regardless, I would say Manitoba industry is still in its infancy in terms of tile drainage. Certainly if you compare it to other jurisdictions like Ontario and Iowa, where there's somewhere in the range of 40 to 50% of cropland drained. I did want to touch on the cold climates of the prairie region, and we're certainly we suffered through that the last few days there, so it was a good reminder that we still are in a cold climate. There's kind of two important factors here. Obviously, the temperature falls below zero for a good portion of the year, and what that means is our soils are also frozen for a good portion of the year, typically 4 to 5 months out of the year. Coupled with that, we have a lot of our precipitation falls as snow over the winter time, and combined that means that a lot of the precipitation, a substantive amount of our total, kind of falls, melts, and runs off in the early spring. And that flow, that runoff is kind of what we call is decoupled from tile drainage. So it bypasses that tile drainage mechanism. So this is a real differentiator between what's happening in Manitoba or across the prairies versus what's happening in our warmer climates like in the US Midwest and Southern Ontario. And that's important because a lot of the literature, a lot of the data, a lot of the understanding we have around things like beneficial management practices are based out of those warmer climates. So, we've got a bit of work to do to better understand our cold climate situation. Okay, so I'll just shift gears now and talk about some of the basic design components. A basic tile system has three main components. We've got those lateral lines, or the perforated pipes that are installed throughout the field. Those are the that's the component that does that kind of heavy lifting in terms of draining the water out of the soil. And then that feeds water to what we call mains or header pipes, and these are typically solid pipes that deliver water ultimately to our outlet. The tile outlet is a pretty important component of the system and should typically be that kind of first thing you think about when planning a system. There's gravity outlets where we have that natural elevation that will allow that water to flow away from the field, or you get into a more costly pumped outlet situation if you need to raise the elevation of that outlet. Okay, we have something called the drainage coefficient. That's another important component of the tile system, and certainly has a big role to play in planning. It's a number that describes the maximum amount of water removal that a tile system is designed for. In Manitoba, a 1/4 inch a day is kind of that design standard. And what that means is there will be a 1/4 inch of excess water drained in a 24-hour period based on the design. So to put that in context, if our soils are already at field capacity, meaning they can't hold any more water against the force of gravity, and if we get a 1-inch excess rainfall event on top of that, it's going to take 4 days on average to remove that excess water from the field. The drainage coefficient affects performance, but also affects the cost of the system as well. So as you get into a higher drainage coefficient, the costs of your system go up, and higher drainage coefficients above 1/4 inch are typically reserved for kind of higher value production. Okay, so in terms of tile depth and spacing, when we look at depth, minimum cover is typically 2.5 feet to maintain pipe integrity. And our typical depth of installation is around 3 to 4 feet in Manitoba. It's important when looking at depth of installation to understand if there's any restrictive layers that might be in the soil. These can be things like highly contrasting soil textures, where you might have a sand over clay, for example, within that crop rooting zone, or significant areas of compaction. So these types of things can really affect the performance of a tile system. The combination of depth and the lateral spacing determines the height of this water table mound I talked about. Now this is important. Obviously, you want to get that water table sufficiently low that favoring that development of a good rooting zone. But there's studies in Manitoba that have shown that shallow groundwater can be an important contribution to our crop water requirement, particularly in the later stages of the summer when we're getting typically into those droughty conditions. So we have the misfortune in Manitoba of having many soils that are both limited by excess water but also droughtiness, and that can often happen in one growing season. So getting that water table at that right height to, again, remove the excess you don't need, but keep that water table close so those roots can access that water later in the growing season is kind of the ideal design objective. And the final comment there is that shallow placement is preferable when it comes to water conservation. The golden rule is to drain just enough water for crop growth, but not a drop more. Okay, so tile drainage seems pretty simple. However, things get a little more complicated when we start to look into our variable soil landscapes. Things may be, when we're looking at a flatter landscape like in the Red River Valley, things are relatively simple, but again, there's a lot going on when we get into our undulating hummocky landscapes in central and western Manitoba and across the broader prairie region. So, this does complicate things around decision making, where to tile, what field to tile, where to tile in the field, and also complicates our design and layouts as well. I'm not going to get into each of these individual things in the interest of time, but my kind of takeaway here is that is the snowflake analogy, that every field's unique and it really requires a field-specific solution, particularly when we get into these variable landscapes. Okay, I'll talk about some of the infield benefits here. And there's a number of them. Of course, the big one is increased productivity, improved yields, more consistent yields across the field. But there's quite a number of other infield benefits as well that producers seek when they're looking at tile drainage. Earlier seeding, earlier access to the fields, Combined, those provide some potentially workload management in the spring, and that early seeding has a direct benefit in terms of yield as well. Reducing risk of crop loss later in the growing season when we have extreme rainfall events. And then there's a couple, probably lesser talked about or lesser known benefits around, first, improving nutrient use efficiency. By reducing those saturated or excess water conditions, one, it reduces what we call denitrification, or the loss of nitrogen to the atmosphere. And it also allows those areas of the field to become more productive, so where inputs have been applied in those areas and in the absence of tile, that productivity is limited. We can end up with some hot spots throughout the landscape. Under a tile system and good agronomy, we can improve that nutrient use efficiency in those areas. And finally, better soil health. Examples of this include reduced compaction, improved soil structure, and organic matter, and in the long term, those can all kind of help in terms of that long-term soil productivity. So let's talk about impact on crop yields. And the kind of a bit of a sad story is that we don't have a lot of good local data, at least that's out in that kind of public realm. So we have to kind of lean on other regions to look at data, and even there's not a lot of information out there. We've got some dated information from Iowa, Ohio, and Ontario, and those results tend to support some data that I don't have on screen that's reported in Minnesota, and looking at corn yield increases in the 10 to 30 bushel mark, and increases in soybean yields in that 4 to 8 bushel mark. So a more recent study in North Dakota, so getting a little closer to home here, showed a 7% increase over 2011 to 2019 in soybean yields. So, that kind of body of literature shows, anywhere kind of in that 7 to 20% range in terms of crop productivity increases. But again, these are from other regions, and we should use those numbers with caution. And I think Manitoba results or Canadian Prairie region results are really, really needed here. A lot of that information's out there, but it's just a matter of getting it into the public realm. Okay, producers in variable landscapes in Manitoba are often faced with a difficult decision come seeding time, and it's, do I go now and have to work around some wet areas of the field, or do I delay in the hopes that those wet areas will become trafficable? And based on the data in this chart, that's seems like a no-win situation. We could see significant yield reductions following anywhere from that first to second week in May, and as a kind of a conservative estimate, that 5 to 10% per week in yield reduction from delayed seeding is something that it's clear what the impacts on productivity that delayed seeding has. So if tile can allow a producer to get on the field a week earlier, you can see that direct benefit there. However, the cautionary note again, cold climates, if that frost lingers in the ground, that really affects the performance of the tile. It doesn't allow that water to drain down. So that's an interplay here in Manitoba, and we certainly saw that in 2022. Okay, okay, salinity. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on salinity. There's a whole session tomorrow afternoon on soil salinity, but I did want to touch on it. So this figure just shows what we call secondary salinity development. When we have a shallow water table, or any water table for that matter, we get wicking of water up above that water table, and that's called capillary action. And the zone that's impacted by that capillary action is called the capillary fringe, where we have that, where a capillary fringe meets the soil surface, we get evaporation of that water that's wicking up, and the soluble salts are deposited and left behind. So over time, those salts accumulate, and they can accumulate to levels that impact crop productivity. Things that drive this salinity development include the shift from permanent grassland cover to annual cropping, and even activities like tillage that creates a bare soil that really drives that evaporation pump. There's kind of two real solutions in terms of permanent solutions to this problem, and one is conversion back to a permanent grassland or hay type of scenario, which will draw down that water table, or the installation of tile drains, and this is a tile drainage presentation, so I'll focus on that one a little more. So when we install tile drains in this situation, you can see the red dots there representing the tile pipes buried in the soil. What that does is it draws that water table down, and that promotes infiltration into the soil. Those soils are no longer saturated. That allows water to infiltrate in the soil and percolate down to the tile. That carries with it soluble constituents like soluble salts. We consider that a reversal of this salinity development mechanism. Tiles can be an effective means of reducing soil salinity, but it's not, not necessarily a quick fix especially in our environments where we're typically in that soil water deficit through much of the growing season. In terms of the cost of a system, typical range in cost is somewhere in that $1,000 to $2,000 per acre. So, tile's not cheap. Cost is highly variable based on a whole number of factors. Talked about drainage coefficient. The lateral spacing is a big one. Outlet, whether it's a gravity outlet or a pumped outlet, has a big influence as well. So kind of the note here is that producer due diligence is, I think, preferable here. It's a big investment, and producers know their land the best. And my advice is make sure that you're part of the design process in terms of kind of that gut feel. Does the design make sense? Are the right areas being drained or not? And really seek advice where there's uncertainties, just to make sure you can optimize your investment. In terms of whether or not tile makes sense with a C, again, there's not a lot of data out there, but there is certainly anecdotal evidence in that I think most producers, they don't stop at just one field. Okay, I'm going to shift gears now. We talked about some of the in-field benefits. I'm going to talk about some of these downstream considerations as well, looking at things like water quantity or the volume of water related to tile drainage, as well as water quality. In terms of the water balance, so looking at the volume of water coming off agricultural fields and the impact that tile has on that, tile certainly does shift the agricultural field water balance. Again, it increases that infiltration by reducing those saturated conditions, and in so doing, it does result in a reduction of surface runoff, and this can be fairly significant. Information published at the University of Minnesota suggests the range in surface runoff reductions around 29 to 45% with the addition of tile. In terms of the total field water runoff, or the total amount of water that's leaving the field, the tile will typically increase that total runoff by a smaller amount, about 5 to 10%, or a smaller proportion, I should say, about 5 to 10%. It also extends the period of water runoff as well. So because it extends that period, because water has to infiltrate through the soil, move to the tile before it moves off the field, it decreases what we call the peak surface flows, or the maximum flow rate that leaves the field. So if you're downstream infrastructure, that's maybe a benefit relative to strictly a surface drainage scenario. We have some recent research here that was conducted in the Red River crack and clay soils in the Red River Valley. And there's three pie charts here, and what they show is that the total contribution to water runoff, phosphorus load, and nitrate load. And surface runoff is represented in orange, and tile discharge is represented in blue. So in terms of that total water runoff, what the researchers were finding is that over 75%, or over 3/4 of that total water runoff, even under a tile drainage scenario, occurs as surface runoff. So that overland flow surface runoff is still the dominant component in our tile drain systems here in the cold climates. And this would differ relative to a warmer climate where tiles run year-round. When it comes to total phosphorus, it's kind of this is a bit of the good news scenario with tile on the nutrient side, is it tends to contribute very little phosphorus to the total runoff. So in this case, less than 5% of the total phosphorus runoff from the field was contributed by tile. Different story with nitrogen or with nitrate, because it's a soluble constituent. I think it was around 40% of the total nitrate load coming off the field was tile drainage flow. So it's kind of that, this is getting into one of those, kind of that offset. There's some benefit or some cost depending on which nutrient you're interested in this case. In terms of sediment, this is a picture. It's not science, but it was provided by a colleague of mine, Bruce Schufelt. The producer took this photo where there's surface runoff from the field meeting tile drainage from that same field. So you can see the surface runoff on the left-hand side is pretty murky, whereas the tile discharge is pretty clear. So again, it's just a photo. It's not science, but it does kind of provide a visual that agrees with the general science on that issue, that tile drainage can reduce surface sediment runoff, and it does that just by overall reduction in surface runoff and slowing that flow off the field. Finally, talked about benefits to soil salinity from tile drainage, and this is kind of that offset is that salinity, it goes somewhere. So it's removed from the soil and it's discharged in the tile outflow there. So in this issue, there's definitely potential for downstream impacts. If that tile is discharging out and moving overland, there's potential for impact to that land and ultimately to surface water as well. What we see when draining saline soils is there's a relatively high concentration of salts initially, and that concentration reduces over time as those salts are removed. This is, in my opinion, this is a gap area in our knowledge, and it's something that I think we would benefit from learning more about. We are looking at this in that research project that I'll speak about in a couple minutes. Okay, beneficial management practices. One of the benefits of tile, certainly over a surface runoff, or a surface drainage scenario, I should say, is that it converts what we call a non-point source of runoff to a point source. So that provides some opportunity. We can more easily monitor that water in terms of how much water there is, the quality of that water. It also allows us to manage that water if we desire to manage that as well for different objectives. When we talk about beneficial management practices for tile, there's kind of three different objectives that we could talk about. One is conserving water, which is minimizing the water that's leaving the field. Another one is improving water quality, so that could be nutrients or salts, as I've just spoken about, or it could be improving soil health in the field itself. We're fortunate in Manitoba to have a suite of made in Manitoba fact sheets. There's a QR code there. If anyone wants to take a look at these fact sheets, they can follow that QR code there, or just Google PAMI tile drainage. The fact sheets are hosted on the PAMI site. So again, it's 10 beneficial management practice sheets developed by myself and Bruce Schufelt at PBS in conjunction with PAMI and Manitoba Agriculture, who funded these sheets. They're kind of 2, 3, 4 sheets. They provide a general overview of the BMP, and also it gets into things like uncertainties around those in our climates and highlights areas for additional kind of learnings. One of the buckets of these BMPs, beneficial management practices, is around evaluation advice, and this really starts with the producer. Again, producers know their field best, often have historic records and things like yield maps that can be very helpful. And it extends obviously to contractors as well as the services of consultants as well. This really gets to understanding the variability of the fields and making sure that the tile design is kind of a design that's going to meet the objectives of of the drainage project. There's lots of tools and investigation methods available if there's some uncertainties in the field or if there's some potential risks that are indicated. The next bucket is what we call in-field BMPs. So these get into things like at the planning stage, just making sure that design and layout is site-specific and is right for that field. Agronomic practices like nutrient management, practicing the 4 Rs. And then looking into things like what can be done to improve soil health, incorporation of cover crops. And in our flatter landscapes, this is where a controlled drainage scenario would come in. Okay, so then we have what's called edge of field BMPs. So these are things that slow or filter or process water as it's coming out of the outlet and before it's released to downstream. A couple examples on the screen here. We have one called a saturated buffer. These are pretty commonplace in the US now. And it's basically you take the water from the outlet and you put it into a perforated pipe along a riparian zone and allow that water to filter through that riparian buffer before it goes into the stream. These are showing to be really effective at reducing nitrogen. We have other technologies like filter beds. Examples include bioreactors that are targeting nitrogen removal, and then we've got phosphorus removal structures targeting phosphorus as well. And then we have finally watershed BMPs, and these are kind of an extension of these edge of field BMPs. They slow filter and process water, but they have other components to them as well. They're scalable, so they can treat more than one field, for example. And they also provide ecological goods and services as well. So the benefits go beyond just a water quality scenario. We have constructed wetlands. That's one option that can reduce nitrogen and phosphorus. And then we've got tile water recycling, which is capturing that tile discharge in a pond or reservoir and then applying it back on the land during periods of drought. So just a cautionary note, make sure you understand your water quality before heading into that scenario. Okay, we're on the home stretch here. I just wanted to share a few points on this, what we're calling the Souris Plains Soil and Water Management Research Demonstration Site. And my colleague Bruce Schufelt and I saw a need for soil and water management research and tile drainage research in southwestern Manitoba in our variable landscapes, and again, looking at that kind of cold climate angle. So thankfully our funders agreed, so I do thank Canadian Agricultural Partnership, Manitoba Crop Alliance, Manitoba Canola Growers, and Manitoba Pulse and Soybean for supporting the project. I'd like to thank our cooperators, Whetter Farms Limited, and we also received some in-kind contribution from AgriDrain and Souris River Watershed District. So what we have is a field scale research demonstration site. We've got 3 field, kind of commercial scale field zones. They're in the black font there, and then we've got 2 kind of research plots in the green and orange. We've got about just right around half of the 320-acre field drained in total. Tile drainage was installed in 2021. So what we have in our research plots, we've got tiles placed along the slope contour, and we have those tiles segregated into 3 different landscape zones. So the relative upper in blue, middle in pink, and lower in yellow. So this is a pretty cool aspect of our project that we know what's going on at those different slope positions. We've instrumented the site, so we're monitoring tile flow, water quality, water table depth, as well as soil moisture above and below the tile, and we're doing that again at these different landscape zones. So what are we seeing for tile flow? Again, we've got our upper slope flow in the blue lines there. We've got flow in liters per second on the left-hand axis there. We're seeing that flow at that upper is about half as much as the flow we're getting out of the middle slope in the pink line, and that's about half as much again as we're getting from the lower slope. So it's pretty interesting data. It's pretty intuitive that you get more flow out of that lower slope position. But it's kind of interesting results, and that we're quantifying it. We can start to think about maybe how we can incorporate this into our drainage design, maybe looking at variable spacing by landscape position. And I had another point there as well, but we know that at some point up the slope, tile doesn't make sense, right? And even if it's flowing a little bit of water, it's maybe not returning that economic return that is desired. So, this type of information maybe helps us better understand that. In terms of soil salinity, we have the salinity map in 2020. And so that was pre-tile, and then we have a salinity map in 2022, so following 1 year of tile. In our yellow, orange, and red colors there, those are zones of the landscape that are impacted by salinity to a point that it would be a significant impact on crop production. So you can see, it's pretty clear that there's a pretty major reduction in our soil salinity classes following 1 year of tile drainage. Impacted 39 acres or 22% of the tile area. 2022 was really a perfect storm in terms of salinity reduction though, so the caution or the caveat here is that it may take another 5 years or more to achieve what was achieved in that one growing season. In terms of water quality, and I'm right at my time here, tile outflow, we are seeing elevated salts in the tile outflow in the orange bar. Relative to surface water in blue, and the Souris River we sample as well in brown. Compared to the groundwater, the tile flow is about half as much in terms of the salinity concentration. And the last one here is that, again, getting back to these slope locations, we're seeing higher concentrations of salt coming out of that lower slope position relative to mid or upper. And again, that's intuitive. But information like this, again, it may help feed into things like tile water recycling. Maybe we want to look at segregating the lower slope flows if we're getting into a recycling scenario. Okay, and then just like to thank the funders again for extending our funding. We have long-term funding for 5 years of monitoring. We're looking at adding edge-of-field treatments, constructed wetland, and a phosphorus removal structure this coming season, and ongoing knowledge transfer. So hopefully we'll see some of you out at our site in the next couple of years as we have some demonstration events. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. I do have some summary thoughts, but I'm not going to step through them in the interest of time today. So thanks, everyone.